All right, we're live. We're locked in. You're locked on. We are live, and this is Misaligned. Tonight, we're asking the question behind all the questions. Do you really have a choice? Do we have choices, actually? Do we actually have free will? Are we just reacting to systems, to trauma, algorithms, or maybe even God? Do we really have any control over this? Let's go a bit deeper, beyond the surface of personal responsibility. Because maybe the freedom we think we have isn't really ours to begin with. Yeah, I mean, want to take it away?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. Welcome to the show. Good to have you guys again, Cross, Jab, Farouk. Seems we're trying to tackle a few sort of related issues today, which I consider important. And I might decide to set the stage by explaining what I consider important about it. And I think that that's helpful because there are times where these conversations can become a bit academic, and people wonder what the point of it is. You know, if you're saying, do we have free will or not? What does it matter if there are no practical consequences? And certainly from my point of view, where it becomes important is in thinking about how society works and being able to find rational, coherent explanation for some of the things that we see, and also being able to think about how we conceptualize fairness and a fair society. So personally for me, that's where this sort of topics become important. I'm sure it will be important it may be important to different people for different reasons. So just not to waste our time with my own personal sort of thinking around why this is important, I think we can delve straight into it. And it'd be helpful to start with the famous philosophical quote, you can do what you want, but you can't want what you want. What does that even mean? And you know, how do we begin to understand that? Because it almost seems like a contradiction of a statement to make. Cross. What does that mean? You can do what you want, but you can't want what you want.
I think it's an interesting thing. It to me it kind of moves a little bit to the consequences of free will. So I can do what I want. I have autonomy over myself and my body to a degree. Although that's probably one of the things that's also worth thinking about as well. Because I'm not religious, so the religious perspective would be more about God determines what happens in my life, etc. I don't believe in that. But there's also some other more interesting perspectives about the things that we're allowed to do tend to be or could be. This is from a more sort of biologically deterministic perspective, that the things that we do are based off of our biology and our sociology as well. I agree with that to a degree. I think a lot of the things that we do in life are not really based off of decisions that we make, but decisions that have been made for us through our own our chemical makeup, our biological makeup, etc. But I think we can do what we want, but we can't. What's that quote again? Remind me. I remember.
So you can do what you want, but you can't want what you want. I suppose it's an interrogation of causality beyond what we most of us focus on, and this is how I'm looking at this. So you can do what you want, and that's correct. You know, if I'm thirsty and I feel like I want a cup of coffee, I can go make myself one. But the question is asking is that where does that wanting to have a coffee come from itself? And then once you begin to interrogate things in this way, what it seems to me, and I'm not preempting what others might begin to say, I'm sure there'll be lots of interest in, is that you get this infinitely or infinite regression of causality, where you just keep going back and back and back, and you can see something caused this and something caused what caused this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and I think this is kind of where I was going. I've just forgotten the specific quote about we want what we want for a number of different reasons. You can't choose what you want. To be honest, I don't think you can. I think that's determined by biology. I think it's determined by chemical processes in our brains. It's determined by sociology as well. What society determines that we should want and we should like. That's one of the Ubuntu ideas about this, which is a philosophy. We can talk about that in a little bit, but it's a more traditional philosophy about how the things that free will is controlled by our own society. Because even though we think we want to do a thing, it really is just what society wants us to do. And I think that's the reality of it. I don't think it's free will in the freest form, in that we can do whatever it is that we feel like we want. To your point exactly, I think a lot of it is predetermined by other factors.
Job, what sayest thou? I think you're on mute, maybe.
Yeah, I'm on mute. Hi. So maybe the first thing we need to do is maybe define what we mean by free will, so that we're all singing from the same sheet. So
Fantastic. Go have a go.
okay. No, I'm going to explain. I'm going to be speaking from this perspective, and I don't know whether that's the perspective that's shared by all of you. I think the idea of free will to me means the capacity to make your own decision without coercion, as it were, without being forced to do it. So, but when you put it that way, do we have free will? The decisions we make, are they devoid of coercion? So I think maybe I can address the religious one, because to me I think that is more straightforward in my head, which is that whilst the threat of hellfire or punishment exists, can we really say that that I've got free will? In other words, would people act differently if they knew, for instance, that nobody was watching them? Would you put your hand into that cookie jar if you knew that there was no camera, nobody was watching you, there won't be any punishment, and it's just there? Would you do it? So that's where I'm approaching this thing from. And for that reason, I think, like, when you think about religion and the idea of heaven and that duality, heaven and hell, fire, I think that with all of those threats, I really don't think that someone who subscribes to that philosophy, the religious philosophy, I would say that the actions that they take are motivated by the desire to avoid punishment and to go to heaven. So I don't think that is free will.
But is that not how society itself is fully structured? Why do people pay taxes if it's not that the HMRC, well, maybe not everyone, but why do majority pay taxes if it's not that HMRC will come after them if they don't? Or why do people not overspeed or drink and drive? Before there was a drinking and driving law in the UK, it was very common. People were doing it all day. I mean, that's why the law came. So is it not the same thing?
So I don't know that is. So at least, okay, I think there's a second layer here, which is that I know where HMRC office is. I don't know I don't know the address of heaven.
because they have not come to look for you because you're complying, isn't it?
No, but you know what I mean. Like, I know where HMRC is, and I know that I've seen people put in prison, right?
Yeah.
Whereas when it's heaven or hell, that extra layer, I think, it's because I take the view that religion is a form of control, or a way that people choose to, like, organize society. So they need this mythology or myths, because if you can motivate people to do things by promising them heaven, and you can demotivate, you can stop them from, or discourage them from doing things by threatening punishment. But the police and the HMRC they haven't got eyes everywhere. Whereas if I sow this idea into your head, you might get self-regulation, as it were. So, but to answer your question, is it different? Maybe not much different, if I'm being honest. I haven't thought about it that way. Maybe not much different.
So what do you make of free will then? Because I'm not sure I understand, because you did make a definition, which is that so being able to do something without coercion, basically. So you can make your own decision without coercion. So and I think we can interrogate that. I think that's a very good way to begin, because often what tends to happen in these conversations about free will is that people can have slightly different definitions for what they mean to be free will, and you then just end up talking past each other. So And I have to say that's one. It seems to me from looking into the subject that that's one flavor of it. There are people who would view free will as that, and I think it often comes from people whose primary motives tend to be to preserve the necessity of personal responsibility, so that you can make a distinction either in regulation or in law from someone who, say, did something because they had a head injury, and someone who did it because they were of normal faculties, and you can make that distinction, and that can be quite helpful. But and that's a flag to plant for us to see that that's how you define it. But yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to that. But it'll be helpful to hear from Farouk. What have you got a different definition? What is free will? Do we have it? Do we not? Where do our wants come from?
Good evening, everyone. I think it's an interesting one, and the contributions have been equally interesting so far. And I think it's also useful to clarify what we mean by free will. Two words there: free will. Okay, and my understanding is similar to what Ijabla has said, Jabs has said, and I guess it's that ability to make decisions, take actions, to act, react, and not act. That's not linked to any previous causes. That is entirely free of influence, of manipulation, of signaling, of consequence, of incentives. So, for example, our decisions to join the podcast today, is it entirely free? Is it entirely devoid of any programming, of any incentives, of any prior events from seconds, minutes, hours, days, and years before, culminating in the event where you decided to act in certain ways? So that's my understanding of free will. It is not my ability to raise my hand and drop my hand. No, that's not my definition of free will. No, it is whether that raising and dropping of my hand is free of any proximal signaling events, either now or several decades or even centuries ago. So that's where I come at it from. And when I define it in this way, I come to a frightening conclusion. And it's a conclusion.
Why are you being dramatic, Farouk?
Yeah, I come to a frightening conclusion, and it's a conclusion I don't take very lightly. And it's a conclusion that I grappled with for years. And when I approach the definition this way, it is the case that we do not have free will. I'm happy to put that out there on the basis of that understanding and that definition.
Cross.
I haven't said that. I haven't said that. I have had conversations where people take, and I'm going to leave my contribution here as a question to everyone. I've had conversations where people take a lot of what we do as free will, avoiding harm, showing empathy, sacrifice, doing good. People define these things as free will. But what I want to say to the audience and to people who listen out there is that animals do these things too. Do they have free will? So that's taking that there's another definition, which is response to stimuli, response to stimulation, response to education, response to trauma, to civilization. Those are responses to the environment. A lot of people define that. Yeah, a lot of people define that as free will. But animals do that too.
Yeah.
So do animals have free will? You can train a dog to avoid harm, to show empathy, to show love. So do animals have free will? If we take response to signaling as free will, which is what many people do, then we must at least consider that animals have free will. So I'll leave it there, and then we can take it further. Thank you.
Okay. I was going to come to Cross. I'm not sure why, but there's a look on Jab's face that makes me think. Yeah, there's a look on his face that makes me think that perhaps he should say something next. I'm not sure why I'm interpreting that. It might just be my free will going berserk there, but
yeah. No, I think your free will is going absolutely berserk. But no, spot on. So I think it's very interesting that perspective from Farouk. But so he's asked a question, but can I ask another question? So if I'm presented with, let's say, two colors now, blue and yellow, and I choose one, is that? I mean, I can't. What do you guys think in terms of free will? So if I choose, let's say, blue.
Okay, I can. In a very weird way, and I can see how this is going to be funny, because Farouk asked the question, you answered it with a question, and what I'm wanting to do is answer your question with a question, which we're going to end up in a rabbit hole here. But just indulge me on this one. So if you think about a self-driving car, right, that gets to a junction and makes a decision, because you've got a self-driving car that's trained by whatever they're trained in, algorithms or whatever. I'm not an AI specialist, to maybe make certain decisions to avoid traffic, to stop at a red light and things like that. And you get this self-driving car that does that. So it gets to a junction and makes the decision to turn left rather than right, perhaps because there's traffic on the right. How's that different from you choosing the color?
It's a bit
Cross
different.
Silent. I'm interested in hearing from Cross. Maybe he's having a shift today as well.
No. I mean, it's. I think we're really getting to the heart of what I was hoping we'd get at anyway. Because I mean, I should give my own definition. I should have done that as well. My own definition is based off the Cambridge version of the definition, which is basically the ability to make decisions or take actions independent of any external influence. That is the only definition of free will. I think with that in mind, I've arrived at the exact same conclusion that you have, Farouk, that it's impossible. And using these other examples I've raised, these other questions, this is the answer to those two questions that Yemi and Jab have also raised, even though they're two different types of questions, because they're determined by two different types of external influence, but they are still influenced. Free will cannot exist in the world because there's always going to be some external influence. The example of choosing the color, for example, there's the piece when you have and this is argued about the nature versus nurture argument, but there's the common thing that said boys would choose blue, girls would choose pink. If that's social, that could be socialized, but it might also be innate in human nature. I don't know the answer to this one, and this is just a good example of it. In cases where it's socialized, when you have this boy grow to become a young man, right, he goes to the shop to buy a thing or to pick up an item, and he goes directly to the blue. He's selecting to choose the blue in his mind, but that decision is not devoid of external influence.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Same thing with the car. The car's a good example.
And it's not just that it's not.
What external influence? What external influence?
So in this case, it's socialization, and this is something that's been raised by this was one of the Ubuntu principles around it. Okay. That I am because we are.
Let me interrupt you. I will draw blue because I know you're going to say blue is boys and pink is girls. Let's take more neutral colors. So let's say it's white and
doesn't matter what colors you pick. The reason why I like the blue and the pink one is because it shows the extreme versions of it. But it doesn't.
Jabs. Cross raises a very powerful influence on will. I wouldn't call it free will because of the conclusion I've reached. That I hadn't thought about, I haven't thought about before. Or maybe I thought about it, but not organized it in the way he put it. Socialization and culture is a profoundly powerful influence on free will.
Yeah. And in fact, the moment you pop out of your
why do young girls like pink? They're given a baby doll, thought to be mothers, told how great motherhood is. I mean, at least in our culture. And then they grow up liking pink, thinking they love it, thinking it's their choice. And then why in our so that's socialization.
Yeah.
It has a powerful influence on what we evolve to like. A lot of us here, our restraint, our discipline, hard work, conscientiousness, our response to following the rule of law directly relates to the families we were brought up in. And the fact that our parents were middle class and instilled the frameworks of incentives, carrot and sticks that then make us feel like we are responsible citizens. Whereas if we were, for example, put in a household or nurtured in a household where both parents were alcoholic, unable to then instill that framework in us, we will be unable to make the choices we make today. Even though we think we are making those choices, it is not devoid of prior influence. So that's socialization. Cross also mentioned something that is fundamental to will as well. He talked about biology. So what made all of us in our teenage years start liking women or girls start...
Speak for yourself, Farouk.
Okay, well, in your case, I mean, what made you in your teenage years start liking men? So, so going back to cross talk. So we know now as scientists that we have hormonal systems that we didn't decide on our own. That makes our for the women makes them go through puberty, varies, makes them go into heat, make them attracted to partners, and vice versa. Is that free will, or that's determined by biology and genetics and things we have absolutely no control about? So that's another powerful influence, biology on will. So, and socialization. So I thought I should highlight that because it's very interesting. I never conceptualized it as socialization. I thought about coming from a family and environmental factors before. But yeah, so that might influence why you have to have chosen blue versus brown. Events from years ago, events in your genes, events from your hormones and your experience, events thousands of years ago that has been encoded in your DNA. Those are the things that come to that point of decision making where you choose your blue versus brown. The fact that you don't know doesn't mean that that decision is devoid of any external influence.
So I get your point, Farouk, but you see, because I have interrogated these questions for a very, very long time, and it was very easy for me. There is no such thing as free will. But at the same time, part of development is that you have to keep questioning things that you know and unlearning and then relearning, if you see what I'm coming from. So I think when I said blue, and that wasn't a good example, I wanted to just use maybe let's say more neutral colors. Call it brown and let's say white, just random color. I don't want to use blue and pink. I withdraw that because I know in my head that would be, we could argue that it's socialization. So a more random color, or let me use a different example now. I give you a pen and I give you a pencil and I tell you, choose. Why do you choose the pencil and not the pen? Although in my head now, thinking about it, you might say it depends on the task you want to carry out, but I don't know.
So my approach to that question would be this, because it's a very interesting question, and I think that's where free will crept into our consciousness, and became cemented in it, because what you are almost alluding to there is the chaos that is involved in what it means to be a human being, and reflected in a lot of other natural systems. So a child is born, and they are a absolute miraculous bundle. They've got billions of neurons with each thousands of synapses running into trillions of synapses in the brain, where it's just doing its own thing. And in many ways, we don't understand what the brain does. I mean, you say this sometimes and people just think, what are you on about? like we don't know how it works. So what we find is there are lots of correlates. You can say, you know, when someone's doing this or thinking this, these areas of the brain light up, and yeah, but it lights up. But how does that how does that activity translate into this stuff? We don't know. And I think that's where a lot of this idea, because it's chaotic, because we don't know, because there's so many things happening that's just way beyond our understanding. But there's also modulation. We can see that people make decisions, and I think Farouk began to talk about this, where this becomes extremely compelling because we make decisions. So when people say, so when I advance the proposal that we don't have free will, I'm not saying that we don't make decisions. We make decisions. I make decisions every day. I made a decision to join this podcast. Children make decisions. Dogs make decisions. Butterflies make decisions. And those decisions don't signal free will at all. I think when someone decides to choose between, brown or green, or it may have something to do with socialization, as very well put, and I totally agree with that. But sometimes it's even arising out of a black box, and I think because it's not always that we can know what it is. Often it's socialization. Sometimes we don't even know where it's coming from, and I think this is not hard to interrogate at all. You can sit and just examine yourself for 5 minutes, and this becomes quite just.
There's a framework I want to put that covers everything.
So if you don't know where it's coming from,
yeah.
Shouldn't we maybe caveat what we're saying? Because if you don't know where it's coming from, how do you know that it's been
I think I do.
Yes,
I think if I could propose, let me propose the framework, because I have a framework.
I'll hold that question. I'll come back to it.
Yes, thank you. Because I was thinking about this for a bit before we had today's session. And I feel it's been something that's been like Farouk as well. I've been thinking about this for a while. So I think over the past couple of days, I kind of came up with a framework where I think there's 4 composite parts that if we strip out, we would say, yes, there is free will. We cannot have free will because there's 4 fundamental there's 4 fundamental areas that affect our ability to have that free will. And I took some additional notes just to expand on it while we're talking. I think for me, there are 4 things. The first one is biological. The second is the sociological. The third is algorithmic, which is a more modern facility. And then the 4th is relational, where we deal with people. And I think it's important to explain that, to break this down really quickly. Biological, we've talked about some of this already. So things like neurology. When I was researching a little bit, there's something called the Haynes study, where they try to assess how people make decisions. And one of the things that they looked at was that synapses were firing 7 seconds ahead of decisions being made. So basically, the researchers could see that people's brains were moving faster than their actual thoughts. So the brains were making decisions before their minds were making decisions through that study, which was very interesting to see, because they were showing that actually biologically we're doing things. There's things like sexual selection that we've talked about already. Why do men like women? Why do women like men? In general, not everybody. Biologically determined. Even men liking men or whatever. The differences in some of these behaviors, especially between men and women, etc. Sexual selection behavior between men and women. How women select men. They like guys that are taller, short, the more stronger, more attractive, etc. There's all of these things that are determined by biology. You cannot, because of these things, they affect free will. Sociological, there's things that affect people's sociological, the general sociocultural and sociological and socioeconomic characteristics or criteria that affect how people are able to behave. Farouk's point that he was talking about a bit earlier about people who have alcoholic parents, children who have had the ACE, I forget, I can't remember what ACE is off the top of my head again, but the childhood
adverse childhood experiences.
Exactly, adverse childhood experiences. They are, I think, 4 times more likely to have bad future careers in terms of turning into, again, alcoholics, etc., things like that. A lot of these things affect their free will. The third is the algorithmic. 80% of the YouTube videos these days that people watch are being recommended. Same thing with Spotify, same thing with Netflix, 70%. We're getting what we don't even know that we should be watching, and our interest being curated for us. This is the modern version. This is because I would have said previously it was just those 3. And the third one I'm going to come to, but the algorithmic is an important one that's affecting the way we behave and how we think and how we make decisions today. And then the 4th is the relational, which we talked about. I think this is where the pink-blue thing comes out as well. It goes a bit more than that because it comes into things like how men should behave, the jobs that we need to pick. We think that we should have free will in terms of job selection, but we don't really. we think we should have free will in terms of how we should behave when younger men are going on dates. A man thinks he has to pay for a date. Why does he have to pay for a date? He feels like he needs to. Does he have free will to do it? Yes. What's he going to do though? The expectations of society, the relationships that exist between people affect how he must behave. So I think you can, unless you're able to strip these 4 key bits of this framework out, we cannot have free will as a people, as a society, as humanity. It's just not possible. It can't exist.
Thanks very much.
Can I put in a quick question? So the example you gave,
there's a pending question that I wanted to answer, Job.
Okay, please, this is important. This is important right. Because it's a new thought that's just coming to my head. So I go out on a date with a girl. The expectation is that I need to pay for the meal, right?
Yep.
That's the expectation. Mm-hmm. And I might do that without thinking about it. If I stop myself and I think, no, actually, I'm not going to do that, and I say, let's split it, and we split it, have I exercised free will?
Not necessarily. That thought that you would split it, where did it come from? What influenced it? Might it be that at some level, ideologically, you've learned to rebel against the majority? Did someone influence you, someone that has educated you to say, look, you shouldn't go with the crowd? The key thing is the definition of free will. That decision is independent of any influence. And I guess the argument by most of us here is that it's unlikely in most cases. And in some cases, we don't know. And it's okay not to know. So really, it's not that. So your ability to turn left or right, to jump or sit, isn't really the definition of free will. It is that those choices, even in your ability to change them, is devoid of any proximal influences. And if we take that definition, then it's highly unlikely that we have free will.
So Farouk, what I'm doing is I'm also being self-critical, you see. I'm critiquing myself because I'm being a spokesman for somebody who isn't here, because it looks like we're all kind of aligned here. But
yes,
if I'm taking an ideological position here because I've been influenced by my politics or whatever it is, right? At some point, somebody would have sat down to say, I'm not paying that bill, whether it's ideological or whatever it is. That first individual who did that, are they making a free will? Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yes. So I'd like to speak to that if I may.
Yeah.
So what it is that to answer that question, Jab, and I think it's a version of the question you asked before. It's another version of it. So to answer that question, because we don't understand a lot about what's happening in our heads, okay, and we're still developing an understanding, and Cross has referenced some of the research that's come out of that, where we actually know, and I can circulate some of these references later on, even though the sort of conclusion that we draw out of that is debatable, but that we know that you can tell, researchers in the lab can tell before someone knows what they're going to choose, what they will choose in many experiments. You can tell that this guy is going to choose this before they know. So that that conscious deliberation that we think is free will is just the culmination of a process that has happened in darkness. So that when it comes to your awareness, that's when you're viewing it as I've made a decision. But 1 million things have led up to that happened in darkness. And how do we interrogate this darkness? It goes to your question, because we don't know, right? Yeah, we don't know in the brain, but we know in a wider sense. There's nothing happening in our brains that happens that will be different from what happens in our world in general. Physicists have spent hundreds of years trying to understand how our world works. And there are 2 laws that we know that govern everything that happens in our universe as things stand. We might find out something in the future. One is the classical mechanics, which is totally deterministic. You would have heard of Laplace's demon. Laplace came up with this theory, which is now widely accepted to be reasonable within physics circles, that if you knew the velocity and motion of every particle in the universe, right, and you had a computational capability to be able to crunch the numbers, you'll be able to predict what will happen next to infinity, to absolute infinity. And you can do that with everything, with your brain with the car, with the plane, which one's going to crash. You can tell with, and that's because in classical mechanics, we know what's going to happen. We can just once you see a ball traveling, we can calculate if we know the mass, the velocity, the wind resistance. We know where this ball is going to land precisely, without a doubt. And then the second law, which happens with small particles, is quantum mechanics. And what happens there basically is randomness. So our universe is ruled by a combination of deterministic laws and randomness. So all you get that's happening in your brain is things that are determined with random jumps. There's nothing else. Like, there can be nothing else in principle. Okay, even though nobody knows how that is happening in our brains, but the physics of the world tells us that there can be nothing else going on there beyond those. And that's it's a stark realization. And I say this, I've listened to a whole bunch of physicists talk about this. There's only one that I think has made an argument that, he's tried to preserve free will. And what he said is that it's a way of talking about the world, and it's Sean Carroll. You can find him on YouTube. He's a very popular American physicist who said, he also doesn't believe in the libertarian free will. He believes that, from physics, not possible. Everything has a cause. But, we're making decisions in our head. That's a good way to talk about it. There's no point splitting hairs, which, fair enough. But every other one you listen to, from Sabine or they'll tell you from physics, this is just not possible. It isn't. You can't have something that's uncaused. Literally.
Chab, did you want to comment something there? I think you're about to say something. I didn't want to cut you off.
No. I am learning, but like I said, I know my position, but I think
yeah,
I'm 100% sure.
You made a very powerful final statement there. You can't have something that is uncaused. That's a bold one. What caused the Big Bang?
We don't know, but it will have a cause.
You don't know that.
So again, that's right. So that's right, because we are talking about, actually. So when you think about, there can't be anything without a cause. You're talking about within our world, okay? So because when you come outside,
I just wanted that clarified.
Yeah, you cannot. Yeah. You cannot
legislate for
anything that's outside of that bubble.
It's in the context of the conversation about free will and about our own reality with the time-space dimension limitation. Yeah. The Big Bang essentially is outside that dimension.
It has to be. So
I'll push back on that, though, actually. And I think this is an argument for free will, because even though we have been talking about elements of free will, and I hate the fact that I have a whole framework here and I'm going to destroy it, but the idea that that everything needs to have a cause, I think is not necessarily founded in absolute reality. Because I'm one of these ones who tends to look at the world and I say that everything that we look at and everything we've done in science, technology, engineering, philosophy, etc., changes consistently. Whether we think about medicine, whether we think about how we do propulsion, how we do, everything we've done is always evolving, and we've always been wrong every single time. Even though we've been wrong by a bit, which in economics we call the error term, I will just put that there on the end of our equation and just add something else. Oh, that explains 10% of that error term. So we were wrong by about 95%, but now we're wrong by about, I don't know, 90. Sorry, we were wrong by about 5%, but now we're only wrong by 4.5. And we're not able to account for all of it. I think we need to also understand that this could also apply in this case. So what you've called, especially when you're talking about quantum, just quantum mechanics and quantum physics, really, at this point, that what you've pointed out there about randomness is very important. And it's also important to point out with something with space, moving into a slightly different topic, but I am quite infatuated with cosmology. But one thing that happens, and we know that happens within space itself, and by space, we're talking about wherever there's the distance between 2 points that exist in the nothingness that was outside the universe. There's no such thing as nothing. And there are quantum objects, particles, that appear from nothing. They literally appear from nothing and disappear into nothing randomly. We don't know their causes. There's no evidence that there's a cause. And I think if we apply this to the free will argument, there's an argument that even though a lot of, or most of, or a significant amount of the decisions that we make can be accounted for through a cause, whether through, if I'm talking about sociological, biological, etc., there's still some elements, to Jab's point, where there are some people who could just decide and say, I don't want to pay this bill, and they've never heard about any of the social norms. They don't have any biological, well, maybe they could, but they might not have any biological wiring from their own piece about that specific activity or that specific choice being made. There's no sociological driver. There's no biological. There's no relational piece around that. No algorithmic push, but they've made that decision on their own. We need to also account for the fact that there might be some things, actually, decisions being made that actually are 100% free will, because they might not have a cause.
Randomness you're talking about. So you are so what you're saying there is you're making a distinction between something that seems determined and something that seems random. Neither of them gives you free will. What free will randomness doesn't lead to free will. Determinism doesn't lead to free will. So what I'm saying to you is that we've got a situation in our world where only one of two things is happening, right? Every given time. So you either have a deterministic situation. For example, someone's grown up in a home where parents have been loving and caring and provided for him and cared for her and sent her to good schools. In many cases, we can see where this is going to go, right? It seems determined, right? And then you've got randomness, where sometimes there's no explanation because it doesn't seem to follow that causal pathway. Something happens that almost defies our understanding. None of that is free will. Okay, randomness doesn't give you free will. Determinism doesn't give you free will. What gives you free will is a complete understanding of what is happening and you being able to go against the causal change.
No, that's if you're going against something, because this is Farouk's point earlier as well. If you're going against something, you're so, and I was using this with the wording that Jab specifically said, because Jab said he's on a date or somebody's on a date. Not you, definitely not you, Jab. I'm not throwing you into that scenario, but we got someone on a date, right? And then that person says, "No, I'm not paying this bill. I am not paying because I'm a man." That is a decision that is based off of sociological and relational expectations and going against them. So the decision to say no itself is
you are going against one thing in compliance to something else. That's always the case. So this is what is happening. So you're going against one thing because there's another influence. So what you're saying happen again is the same thing.
So let me give Cross an example. You've got a trained dog that they've been with the owner all their lives, and the deterministic outcome from that relationship is that when the owner comes home, they go and jump over it and wag their tail. But on this fateful day, they attack the owner and they hurt the owner, only for you to do an autopsy and find that they've got a brain tumor. So the change in behavior in itself that is random does not take away free will, does not take away the fact that it's on cost. So Jab's refusing to pay, insisting on splitting the bill for his date. As against the sociological programming does not in itself mean there isn't that decision is free. There may be other influences that relate to anything of your core frameworks that still makes that not free.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let me put this.
I'm not sure. Sorry, Cross, I'm surprised you said exactly. I thought you were on my side because
no, no, but I said exactly, but probably for a different reason. I should probably have just explained what I meant.
Yeah.
But by exactly, I'm saying that in situations in which there's a cause, and if you use the example of the tumor in the dog's brain, there is a cause. That cause might be an adverse cause to an expected behavior, but it doesn't explain the reality, because you just proved that other one of saying, well, people could act out of character, essentially, and it can still be free. It can still not be free will. It doesn't explain the fact that there's some element of randomness that might not actually have any cause linked to any part of the framework.
But randomness.
I think the operative word there, Cross. The operative word there is any known cause to us. We don't know.
No, but my point is no cause. The fact that we don't know the cause doesn't exclude the fact that there could be no cause.
So let me jump in there, Cross. So I think where you're getting a little bit stuck there is that randomness only happens at a fundamental level, right? So at the point of organization where a decision is being made, it is not random, it's caused. The randomness would have happened a bit further down, say, I don't know if quantum mechanics hold in at the neuronal level in the brain, but let's say it does, and a firing happens there that triggers something. At the point where you're making a decision, it's not random, right? You've had a thought about it, even if at a spinal level, put it that way, you're reacting to something. Okay, there is a cause. There has to be a cause. You cannot.
I think you're focusing on the randomness rather than focusing on the ability to make a decision that isn't predicated on anything specifically. Yes. Where I am making it. Yeah, go on. Sorry, go on.
Please, I do want someone to explain to me why the example of that date shows that I haven't exercised free will, because
relational and sociological. It falls within both.
Yeah, and if you take Cross's for domain that he talks about, in terms of relational,
logical, algorithmic, and biological.
Yeah, all of those things actually work in that in predicating that I pay, because but I look at all of those things and I'm aware of all of those things, and I say to myself, actually, I'm not going to do that. And I say,
well, I mean, Gabs, you are a rebel.
And 1 second. You have
been one on a range of issues for a long time.
Yes.
So that is consistent with your with your nature, and that is in itself not on cost. Something triggered that rebellious nature, that challenging the norm. I guess the point is, in understanding and defining free will, it's not the decision in itself that one is looking at. It is whether or not that is on cost. And I guess the submission, I think there's general consensus on that, is that almost always there are things that have happened at the cellular level, at the societal level, at the programming level, at various levels that ultimately influence that decision making to the extent that it cannot be defined as free.
No, it goes back to definition. It goes back to definition, and it's what I said earlier. The Cambridge definition was ability to act independently of any outside influence. So if I'm deciding not to pay on that date, more often than not, it's because there is some sort of psychological deterministic viewpoint or some social ideology that I'm deciding to implement or to utilize about equality or whatever, doesn't matter. But there tends to be an external reason why, going beyond me just making that decision on its own. I think that, and I was trying to be devil's advocate there a little bit, Jab, but it ain't working out. It doesn't work because the reality.
So there's another folk definition of free will, which tends to be fairly common in folk use, which is that you have free will if you could have done differently. So you, on any given occasion. So when you chose not to pay for the date, right? If the world was rewound to that exact moment again, and everything was exactly what it was at the time. Your frame of mind, everything that happened before, where you sat, the noise level in the restaurant, that you could have done differently. And what we know from our phenomenological sort of interrogation, but also from how the world works, is that that's not possible. If you rewind the world back to where it was at the time, everything being exactly the same, the evidence that we have points to the fact that you would have done exactly the same thing 1,000,000 times over. The reason why you have that look on your face, Cross, is because of this. And we've talked about this in our podcast in the past. So what you have is, we have this thing, this chaos theory, of which I'm not an expert. So you have so many things that you have to compute into one to make one decision. And this is what a human being is. You know, I think most people will agree, and I've looked up this before. There's lots of scientists agree that there's nothing that we know as humans that's more complex than the human brain. There's nothing. Again, that's debatable, but I've actually Googled it and checked what the controversy is. Most scientists agree that sounds fair take. So what you have there is, you've got chaos, right? And because there's so many things fitting into one decision, it almost feels like there is something happening there that's magical. There isn't, right? It's like the weather. You know, nobody can tell us what's going to happen precisely in 2 weeks' time in the northwest of England with the weather. They can't. There's nothing mysterious about it. The reason is that even the slightest change in wind velocity will turn sunshine into flooding, right? And that's how the human brain also works. The slightest thing, you can change just the hue of the light in the room, and Jab will be paying the bill that evening, right? You can play different music. I'm telling you this. You can have a different meal, right? Depending on how ingrained that behavior is. I'm not saying all behaviors are easily tweaked in that way, but I'm just showing that very tiny changes can over time produce radically different outcomes. So the point I'm making is that we are a product of two things, basically. Okay, so just thinking about the biological framework is that it's your genes, so your natural predisposition, and the superimposed sociology. Okay, there's nothing else that exists, and it's a combination, it's a complex interaction between those that's making you think the next thought you think here, the next word that comes out of your mouth. It's all of that. There's nothing else.
Can I throw another confounder? So this afternoon.
Sorry, if you're changing, I just want to address a couple of things.
No, I'm not changing it.
Okay.
Just maybe something to just reinforce the point I was trying to make. Okay.
Yeah.
So not seeing a colleague since we left uni, donkey years ago, right? So he's visiting the UK, and I tell myself, right, I'm going to go to Manchester and see him. If you ask me, I think that I did exercise free will there. It was my choice to go and see him. I could have just stayed back. So how does that fit into this idea that free will does not have, it's acting without
we better let Cross say something, but I think what the distinction we need to make there is the difference between voluntary action and involuntary action. I think that's where you're still maybe struggling, Jab. I can talk about that if we've got time. So there's a difference between voluntary and involuntary action, and free will, not free will, but Cross.
So I think there's two things there that I just need to unpack from what you said, and I think that go against what you're saying. The first is I like the idea of chaos theory, but it doesn't necessarily explain. Well, before even that, the first thing was what you said about and I've read that when I was looking up some bits about the arguments for determinism as well. This is one of the arguments of determinism, that if you could roll back time 1,000 times, if you roll back time 1,000 times, you're most likely going to make the same decision, or if you're going to make the same decision is the argument. I don't think I agree with that claim. I think that's falsifiable. There's a couple of examples about why that's automatically falsifiable. So it's an unfalsifiable claim, first of all, because we can't go back in time. Time goes one way, so we can never go back to check or to test this hypothesis. That's one. The second thing
is we in fact can, but I'll explain to you. We can. Okay. We have done it. We've done it. We do it all the time.
Of course, but we can't do it in, and this is the key thing for me is the absolutes. So the example I would use is Buridan's ass. I don't know if you're familiar with Buridan's ass. So that's the donkey that's stuck between two hay bales and ends up just not eating anything and dies of hunger. Yeah. Because they put the donkey right in the middle, exactly between precise distance between two hay bales. The donkey is unable to make a decision. If that donkey made a decision, there's a 50, because the reason why the donkey couldn't make a decision is kind of supposed to be a thought experiment that humans, given the exact same opportunity with an exact precise difference in terms of benefits and costs, is not likely to make a decision. But the reality is we make decisions. So if someone is at Buridan's ass at that point, where you've got two hay bales on both sides of you, where they have the exact same heap of hay, the exact same quality, and you make one decision, if you go back in time, there's no specific reason why that donkey won't go one way or the other way, unless there's some additional factors, especially if you account for all other things being equal. There's no lights, there's no visibility of the differences in any kind of hay, there's no symbolism or anything. It's a completely dark room. You just know there's one way, there's one way, you turn that way, you can smell the hay, you go that way, you smell the other hay, you go. That decision gets randomized every time you make it. So the randomization of these decisions is important, which means that idea that if we go back in time, we would make the same decision, to me is falsifiable. It's falsifiable when you go into absolutes. The second thing was around the idea of I've forgotten. It's fine. We can hand that over. I forgot the first part.
Okay. So I think we've gone about an hour now, and I think overall we're fairly aligned in our recognition that most of what we do is without cause, and that indeed we can link it to several things happening at cellular level, at societal level, at programming level, at relational level, and we may just be reacting to stimuli in our environment. We will run away from danger. Now, given this alignment and given this recognition and our conclusions that to a large extent we do not have free will. I mean, I recognize Jab's context-specific examples. What are the implications for how we live our lives, for faith,
for moral responsibility?
Yeah, for what are the implications for faith, for morality, for the criminal justice system? Perhaps we should go into this part and then look to wrap up soon. You hear me?
I think that's very important, and I think that's one of the things a lot of people struggle with. And I think often when you begin to get into this question about moral responsibility, most people who push back about free will, most people who push back most passionately, that's what I sense that they're worried about. They envision, there's this almost subconscious worry that if we go down this route of telling people that they don't have that they don't have free will, that we're just going to have a Wild West. It's not true. So moral responsibility still holds. If someone is a problem, if they embody a problem, then they are the problem, right? You can't. So if a lion is going to kill us, what do? We lock them up somewhere, right? It doesn't matter whether the lion has free will or not. None of us thinks about it in that way. If a hurricane is going to kill us, right? We think about how to stop the hurricane. It doesn't matter whether the hurricane has free will or not. And so moral responsibility to me is actually better addressed by understanding that a lot of all people's behaviors are caused. We may not know the causes of some of them, but they're all caused. And there is a perfectly legitimate way of thinking about this that is founded on evidence. So we know that the vast majority of people, okay, there'll be like, sort of every human trait that you take, there will be outliers. The outliers don't debunk anything. In fact, they're built into our models of understanding of this. But, if you put a speed camera on my street to deter speeding and you punish people for overspeeding, what you will find is that the rates of overspeeding will crash, You solve a problem. It doesn't matter whether people have free will or not. The system of incentives and punishments, they work. So you've got to keep using them.
Yeah, a thought just occurred to me right now. And it's counterintuitive, but it just sprang up in my mind as I was listening to you. And I think I can now say that without us knowing it, it is indeed a recognition of the fact that we do not have free will, that we put up systems of incentives to modify choices.
Absolutely. It's called
that fundamentally addresses the fact that we don't have free will, rather than false apart if we don't have free will.
We give birth to children, and
the
from day
whole
one,
idea
from day one,
carrot and stick.
Yes.
The whole idea of carrot and stick, heaven and hell, punishment and reward only makes sense if you think about it, if we don't have free will.
Yes. To modify and
modify our will,
ingrained behaviors into people,
to cause how we behave, to modify how we behave, to calibrate how we behave, to punish and to reward. Because if indeed we had free will, then there will be no point for carrot and stick.
You just tell people that
because it don't work. But it is indeed because we do not have free will that carrot and stick exist, that heaven and hell exist, that right and left exist. Because these things, it just occurred to me now as Yemi was speaking, that if you think about it this way, then it makes sense that we do not have free will. That is why I can tell my child, go to bed at 9, otherwise you get a stick. Yes. Read your book or you get the carrot. So I'm modifying. I'm indeed exploiting the fact that choices are cost.
That's a good point.
Yes. So any of you can contest this, but you give birth to children, and from day doc, you recognize this, and that's what you begin to do, because you know that if you ingrain into them routines and being polite, and that in the vast majority of cases, predictably, you can tell this is how they're going to behave. When they're 18 and they go away from home, they'll be doing everything that you condition them to do, saying, "Oh, this is my free will. I just chose to be polite. I'm a polite."
No,
just to be. No, you didn't choose to be polite.
You've actually manipulated
the
fact that will is
to be like this.
Yes.
What about groomed? Because nowadays groomed is a bad word. It used to be a good word.
I use that in a positive sort of in a sort of a almost not even positive, just a neutral,
real use of the word.
A neutral groom.
I think a more benign synonym would be you were raised to be like that.
Yeah. So and if you look at it, this is what is happening. So even within criminal justice systems, this is what is happening. So you bring people into prison, for example, or give them community services. This is exactly what you're trying to do. Now there will be outliers. There are some people who, and again, this is not because they chose to be. We know about things like psychopathy. We know that people who don't have empathy. They don't feel it. Right? There's nothing you can do about it. You can so even if you dangle murder in front of them, that you're going to kill them like capital punishment, they still won't feel empathy. Right? They can't make themselves feel it. Okay? Yeah. So and that's no proof of free will. This is no proof that they're just choosing to be bad. No, this is how they are.
I've got some thoughts as well in terms of the implications on just dealing with societal challenges, governance, etc. And I think I'm just extending on the framework that I was putting together, and it becomes even more imperative that, to the point that you've already raised, that there isn't free will, but we can influence these behaviors through targeting and focusing on these key areas. Biologically that's already automatically done. When you've got deviants within society, they tend not to reproduce. That is just what it is. The least attractive, the least intelligent, the least productive, the least, well, the ones who are neurological deviants, like the narcissistic ones and the psychopathic ones, tend to, again, also not reproduce. So they tend to remove themselves or exit themselves from the gene pool anyway, societally. So that tends to resolve things or reduce things for the next generation. Sociologically, we can start. I mean, we do this already. We've already started, re-engineering what happens sociologically around what we find acceptable, what isn't. We need to, and that happens through social media reinforcement. That happens through propaganda being shared by the government. This happens through just the general local society.
The education system, the federal, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health. These are massive systems societies have deployed to influence will.
Yes, exactly.
Our kids have been taught religion, maths, English from primary school. You are influencing their will, and indeed, it is the fact that after all our conversations today, I'm beginning to realize that we are actually acting, recognizing that we do not have free will. Because if we did, we would not be deploying so much societal resources to try and influence it.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. Exactly my point. These 4 areas, and if you think about them, if you really think about it, these 4 areas are so critical. The relationships that we have within different elements of society, so important. Whether it's at work, whether it's at home, whether it's within your local community, whether it's with your general family, your culture, etc. That tends to control how we behave. The algorithmic aspect of it. Look at all of the way social media already works. There's no point even going into that one. That we need a whole topic to talk about that specific thing, but it affects the way people behave, and it controls people's actions, thoughts, motivations, and general behaviors as well. Like I said, the biological one we can remove. Sociological as well is also pretty damn important as well. When you start thinking about the aspects that deal with, when you start focusing on things like universal basic what's it called, universal basic income, I think, when you start pulling people up from the bottom, which again, we're trying to figure out what works, because we're trying a few different systems, raising taxes, increasing welfare. In some cases, I am not for that. I'm quite right wing, to be honest. In some areas, we can discuss this left, right wing. I'm sure we probably have a very interesting conversation on this one.
Yeah, I've got a question for Jab on that now that you've mentioned it. And I think I'm directing the question. I'm not picking on you, Jab. It's because you've been relatively quiet over the last 5-10 minutes. But take whatever you know or agree or believe or about free will. How does that impact on how we build society? Capitalism, socialism, call anything whatever name you want. What do you see as the implication of even thinking about this? Right? How do we build societies? What, if you were in charge, what should we be doing? I don't know if the question makes any sense, but
no, the question makes sense, and I think I agree with everything that has been said so far, which is why I haven't said a thing. And so, obviously, to build a society, we've had this conversation before, and in fact, I think it was another conversation I was having with friends today, which is that you've got to okay, put it this way: you've got to start from your values, and you've got to decide what kind of society do you want to live in. So, for instance, what society do I want to live in? Do I want to live in a society that, high crime rate, infrastructures are broken, diseases and ailments and all of those things? No, I would prefer to live in a society where, freedom of speech, light, infrastructure, good health, and all of those things. Therefore, for me, that is what government is supposed to do. How might government then achieve it? So, various different ways. But here, we're going to focus on education. I have always seen education as a form of conditioning. That's how I see education. I see education as, well, it's many things, but primarily it's about, conditioning, socialization. If you use it in those positive sense, we don't call it propaganda, but if it's someone else that is doing the same education, but it's not what we want, we call it propaganda. So so I'm going to say education is also itself a form of propaganda. And I agree with you. It is because we do realize that actually we can influence what people think, how people behave, and we reward behaviors that we want to see, that we want to promote as a society, and behaviors that we don't want to see or that we want to discourage, we
punish them.
Well, not even just punish. I wanted to use punish, but it's not always the case that we punish it, but what's the word now? You make it like a stigma, like, so you can stigmatize.
So even the stigma punishment.
Indeed, what I want all of us to recognize, and I want our listeners to recognize, is that having gone pre the decision making to influence the decision, we then come and say, oh, you have free will, you made the choice. No, you did not.
Absolutely.
That has been the position before today.
Absolutely.
We come and tell you, you chose to be good, you chose heaven. No, we had manipulated the process before. But we come to you and say you can. And I think that's what we've done. I mean, and it's good we're having this conversation now, and we can lay it bare that actually most of society, all societies, deploy so much of their resources from birth till death in trying to manipulate people's will.
Yep.
You call it in many ways you call it good upbringing. You call it education, you call it socialization, you call it culture. All these are aimed at making you the model citizen of that culture.
Yep.
And then you come and say, oh, I'm a model citizen. I chose good over evil. I chose law to be law abiding over law breaking. No.
Yeah.
So that's not on course.
So your nervous system's conditioned in a certain way. And you've been presented this system of incentive and punishment that interacts with your nervous system and produces a similar outcome in the vast majority of people that you now describe as free will. Like the majority of people who go through that same system of incentive and punishment as you will turn out in the same way as you.
Yeah,
give or take. You know, where's the freedom there?
Yeah, and that's a good point, because then again, within that cohort, say like within your class, there might have been somebody who's come from like, I don't know, dad is an alcoholic or was in prison, and social services involved, so they've had to, all that trauma, and then they may just not fit into that successful story, and people might then look at that and say, well, bad choices and all of those kind of
things. They made their choice.
And those ones are overrepresented in prison. And permit me to say this, it's not something but it was one of the striking things that I saw working with disenfranchised people of a certain type, that, you sit down with people who are in a similar position, and you talk to them, and after a while you think, wow, all of them just tell you the same childhood story.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, I'm not saying exact, but you get the point. Like, it's so similar, I could make it up. Right? Yep. They just come in and tell you the same childhood story. And this is how they ended up here. Now, you go and look at the people who become top bankers and sit with them and listen to the stories as well. And I'm sure you'll be stunned about the similarity. Again, it's not going to be carbon copy, but the themes will quickly emerge about, how, okay. And so I think this whole self-made, I made myself, it's a myth. It's rubbish. It's and to me, this is the heart of this free will debate. It breeds humility of a certain type. Maybe not humility in every sense, but of a certain type. It breeds gratitude of a certain type. It breeds compassion of a certain type. You walk into people who are struggling, and you think this could have been
empathy.
Me. Yeah, that this could have been me. If I grew up, if I was born under these circumstances, grew up here, this would be me, right? There's a 99% chance this would be me. And that it just changes, in a sense, how we look at people and how we view life and how we attribute things to ourselves and to others. I think there's a good case, and I might be pushing this now, but you can view even people who do criminal things, very bad things, you can view them as you would wild animals. There's no need to take this personal, and there's also no need to condone it. Right? If a hyena is going to kill all of us, we're not going to be petting it on its head. Right? we will take drastic action. But that doesn't mean that we think that this hyena is some agent of free will that's just doing what he wants to do to kill us. This is just what it will do, right? And then we can tame it. We've done it as humans. We've tamed wild animals. This cat that we live with now, they used to be wild animals, right? We've tamed them. We've voluntarily tamed them, right? And so there's scope for that. Again, I'm not saying there's unlimited scope for it, but there is scope for it. We've done it before. We know that we can do it.
Final thoughts, guys. And I want to link this to geopolitics. Ijabla already starts implications for Nigeria, for Africa. We don't have free will as a nation, so our jaga jaga is not. It's not. Our jaga jaga is not a family cause. What can we do about recognizing now that there is no free will? Nigeria no jaga jaga because there is some. We chose to be that way. What can we do about it?
Education.
Final thoughts, and then we can close.
Education. I would suggest that, bearing any fancy things, my contribution would be that we should ramp up the volume of conversations. I think that when you talk and rub minds and offer critiques and listen, and society gets better. And I think we need to force that within Nigerian spaces. I think we need more and more people talking to each other about everything and thinking a lot about it. I know there are a lot of other things that sort of should flow from that. I understand the influence of the power structures in the world, but I think until you have enough people who are informed enough to be able to make day-to-day choices that consider these things, I think it'll be difficult. Which is why I go back to conversations. Yeah.
Cross.
I think for me, the thing that's just really jumped out for me is just expanding on, this. I mean, it's a tiny little framework that I'm putting up, but I think it makes a lot of sense and can be applied. And just taking in what Yami's just said as well about the importance of awareness. I think making people aware of the fact that, free will, if it exists, is likely to be an error term. It's a very small proportion, and we don't even know if it exists or not. If it does, it's a very small proportion of what the decisions are that we make and the actions that we take on a day-to-day basis. We need to look at the ways that we are biologically, how we actually are, understand that as people, and make people aware of the things that we do, the decisions that we make, and how we act, how we behave as a result of our biological urges. I think we need to focus on the sociological elements as well and try to reach out. Some people have been doing this, but again, I don't think it's a wholesome approach to supporting people in terms of looking at the poorest, but also understanding the other parts of the poorest within the countries that we have, because a lot of people are poor in Africa. I'll be honest, a lot more than they are in the West, and it's a lot harder a problem to deal with and to treat. But we need to really target that and focus and say which people are the best that we can target to help move to a point where they're able to utilize the other elements. I think the algorithmic thing is also quite important. Africa is becoming the tech world now, because there's a lot of different tech hubs that are there. We're really ramping that up. We need to utilize the awareness that exists to push people to really start thinking about the kind of content that we're creating,
impose controls if we can,
and impose controls. Exactly. So controls around what people can or can't see. Again, this is one of those ones that goes on the deliberation. We need to figure out, well, who's imposing the controls and how and why, etc. But that's a different conversation. We should impose controls. We should be influencing what's being surfaced to people. And then finally, just sorting out the relational elements. One of the biggest issues we've got in Africa is the corruption piece, because the relationship that exists within our societies there is quite really focused on monetary superiority and gain. We need to reset those relationships so people start caring about the things that we used to care about before, which was about the importance of culture, the importance of morals, of ethics, traditions. We've lost that. We only focus on money. I think those are the key things that we need to do by just focusing on creating awareness through conversations like this or any other conversations that we can create that make people become aware and also engage in the topic.
Thank you, Jabs. Thoughts for policy for Nigeria, for Africa?
No, I think that question is it's a very big question, Farouk, and almost a subject on its own. So it's difficult to force you all into, a sentence. But if I may, related to this, not quite what we're talking about. I've been thinking lately, like, I think that I almost kind of feel like us humans. So first of all, we are animals, and yes, we may be, the most intelligent and the most creative, and depending on how you define creativity and intelligence, but at the end of the day, we are animals. And where am I going with this question? It's because more and more I'm starting to think that we are maybe guided by we may deny it, but I think that our animal instincts are actually very, very strong. And people who understand these things, who are in government and maybe in shadowy places, use this in terms of how they control us, but just to profit themselves. But at the same time, when it comes to then, government, and to answer your question more specifically, I suppose we could. So it comes down to education at the end of the day. This is what I'm going with, and all of this. It's about education, and first of all, those values. It's a big conversation. So I'm just trying to see how I can get to that point without going round the blocks.
So education, education, education.
It is education, education, education. But
Jab doesn't just education.
Why are we stealing? Why is there so much corruption? Why have we now focused on profit and just get rich by all means? Do you see? So if we were to build that society, we are going to have to go back to that education that we're talking about and trying to see how we can modify people's thinking, people's behavior by rewards and carrots and sticks, like you were saying, and see if we can realign people's mind to understand what it is that is valuable. What sort of society do we want from where I was starting earlier?
Excellent. I think there is clear alignment there. The recognition that there isn't free will gives us opportunity to intervene, to modify, to be empathic, to show compassion, to show understanding, and to be humble. And the takeaway message, therefore, is we can absolutely influence will at individual level, family, community, and societal level. And that presents opportunities for policymakers in Nigeria and Africa to institute conversations, as Yemi has said, modify culture, as Cross has said, to institute educational programs, as Jabs has said, to try and unite, change society, to then make us, to start from the perspective of ourselves, making choices that does not sabotage ourselves, that is not self-sabotaging like corruption and the rest. I think if I'm allowed, I can say thank you everyone for joining us. It's been another interesting episode of Misaligned, although I would say we're fairly aligned this episode. And we look forward to we look forward to seeing all of you again next week, and keep a date with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Signing out.
Cheers, everyone.